No, so it's really amazing that you've chosen to be here. I'm going to tell you this a couple times. I love bits. I love the fact that you have chosen to do this. For every person who comes to something like this, I think we need 10 or 100 people to do the same. And hopefully through the time that we have together today and the other activities of this organization, you can both meet people who can kind of inspire you and help you, sort of find new ways to do this, but also maybe we can help each other sort of show people how important this is. So what I want to talk about today is the urgency of our moment and why the things that we're doing here are important. But I'm going to say along the way, they might not be enough. So let's have a little challenge with that. All right. Oh, there we go. So our shared endeavor. I feel like people come to an event like this because they're interested in rigorous research, in precise research that empowers people. I feel like a lot of our research is about, turning the reality of our day into the things that we want for tomorrow, whether these are aspirational or whether we're trying to get through some desperate times. I feel like, science is wonderful. The discovery process, the collaborative process is wonderful. But when we look at the big picture, the idea that we can use our skills and insights to empower people tells a lot of the story. Quality of life is the dependent variable of interest for me. So with that in mind, that's it. There we go. I just want to thank you for making the choice to be here, because I know it's not an easy choice. I know that at dinner tables and in some department meetings or in, hallway conversations, deciding to be involved in an endeavor like this is not the easiest thing to explain. But I want to walk through why it's more necessary today than it ever has been. So in terms of an outline, I want to talk a bit about urgency. And then I'll talk about our current circumstance, both in terms of how this relates to your opportunities. I'll talk about it from the funding perspective, and how what we do today relates to public confidence in science at all. I'll show you a relationship that you might not have seen before, but many of the questions that people are asking about science and society are actually not independent of the conversations that we're having here today about how we do what we do. And then finally, I'll talk about some opportunities for improvement. So let's talk about urgency. Throughout the world, there are people who've never set foot on a university campus. In fact, most people in the world have never done that, right? Many people have never been in an air-conditioned building, as we are today. And in their daily existence, they have opportunities and challenges that are hard to imagine when you're at a university. But the scale and reality of the challenges that people face are, just because we can't see them, doesn't mean that they're not immense, right? And so when you're in an air-conditioned building at a university, there's this question about, well, what can I do with my day? What can I do with my day? And so there's a lot of really amazing things you can do with your day at a university in terms of educating, in terms of the students that you encounter, in terms of the colleagues that you have and things of that nature. But there are a lot of things that we can do with our day. And so when you think about the things you could do with our day, sorry, I'm a little bit behind. So this is the world that I'm talking about. There's a question. And the question is, in your role today at a university, if you could think, okay, here we go. If you could save a life right now, would you do it? And I think most people are inclined to answer yes, but I want to walk that question closer to the choices that we make on a given day in an air-conditioned building at a university, okay? So as I think about this, one book that really caught my attention years ago was Rigor Mortis by Richard Harris. Richard Harris is a longtime writer for NPR, National Public Radio, and this book is very accessible. And it is about how the conduct of research in medicine and public health does or does not lead to the outcomes that we all want for folks in that field, the outcome of saving lives or improving quality of life. And so much of it is about the things we're going to talk about today, about replicability, right? About the relationship between the claims that are made about research and the actual underlying empirical and theoretical corpus that people observed when they were doing research. Sometimes there are gaps. because we overgeneralize, or because we do things with statistics to try and make a relationship look a certain way, because it will help us maybe achieve a professional objective. But in so doing, it creates a gap between the realities of the empirical and theoretical corpus and the claims that we make. This book is both, I think, intriguing, but it's also tragic, because it shows, like, there's several examples where, because of publication bias, there are literatures that where the scientific consensus is that if you do intervention X, outcome Y will happen. And so people say, well, let's try and scale that. Let's run some clinical trials. And so they'll spend tens of millions of dollars on clinical trials, and it doesn't work. But the literature, all the literature says if X, then Y. And they're like, we can't get it to work. And so, Harriet, you know, if you're at this conference, you can tell where the story might have gone. There's actually some looking, well, what about the papers that didn't get published? What about the trials that were not reported, right? And what you find is that what they were finding, because when the clinical trials weren't going well, the initial assumption was we must be doing the trials wrong. But instead of, upon reflection, it was like, no, not all of the trials were reported in the research. And what they were getting in the later stage trials was actually very similar to what they saw in the lab. It's just not similar to what was published, okay? So this is part of a more general incentive system in academics, where what we do is we check the box. We run a study and we check the box. And check the box usually is we've gotten a publication. So we check the box, put it on the Vita, bring it forward when we go for tenure, promotion, or a job. And we declare victory, right? Because we did it. We did it, that we can tell people we did this. And I have nothing against publishing papers. I have nothing against publishing papers. But the question is, when we think about the public value of what we're doing, if we check the box, declare victory, and move along to the next thing, there's a question about, well, what is it exactly that we've done? What exactly have we advanced? Okay. So, let's think about that question in different fields. And there's different ways to ask, like, what we've done. So for example, in medicine, in certain areas of medicine, when we operate in a certain way, when we produce research in a certain way, people live, children live, aunts and uncles live, grandparents live. And sometimes we have experimental evidence where we can see where they lived and they wouldn't have lived before, or they live with a certain quality of life that they wouldn't have had before, right? And in public health, we can do the same thing. We can see that a type of intervention with an individual or a community leads to an improvement in quality of life, an improvement in health that wouldn't have existed before. We can see that. Even in certain areas of engineering, where you're trying to build devices, you're trying to build platforms, right? There are ways to see that it's working so that communities, organizations, people like that can do things tomorrow that they couldn't do today to improve quality of life, right? But what's interesting about all these fields is you not only have the ability to see this, if you choose to look at the world in a certain way, you can see something else. You can see that when you're not as efficient as you could be, when you're not as honest as you could be, when you don't commit to the fidelity of the theoretical and empirical corpus as it could be, sometimes what you can see is the lives you didn't save. Sometimes you can see the lives you didn't improve. And at that moment, you have a choice, right? So it's interesting to be in those fields. And then there's social science. And so the question is, are we the same or are we different, right? So some people might say, well, the social sciences are different, right? Because it's really not about saving lives or improving lives in that way. And so one question I'd ask you is, if that's true, why are we doing it? Why are we doing it, right? Because I was in Washington, I'll show you later. And so one of the rules when you're assistant director of the National Science Foundation overseeing the social sciences, any member of Congress, or any member of the presidential administration at any time has the right to ask you the following question. This thing that you're responsible for 20 years ago funded this. Why did they do that? This thing you're funding now, why are you doing this? This thing you're talking about funding, why are you doing this? And in particular, why are you funding this instead of more research on childhood cancer? Okay, that's a real question that you can be asked. And so I'll just tell you personally, I love social science. I want to be in that conversation acting honestly, right? And I want to be able to talk about social science where it's in that conversation. When we talk about the most important things to human life, social science is a part of that outcome. But the point is, are we in that conversation? Now, I understand when you think about public goods, when you think about theoretical things, the outcomes are harder to see, all right? But I just ask, we try to see them. So I'd ask a question, how many of you have conducted work in multiple countries? Multiple countries. How many of you have conducted work in multiple countries? Okay, great. So when you conduct work in multiple countries, you can see things that sometimes you can't see by studying in one country. I think I've worked in about 20 countries. And for a while, I worked a lot on poverty reduction, infant mortality, and childhood malnutrition. And the work was trying to help governments think about incentive systems that will allow them to take the resources they have and get better outcomes, okay? I've seen things in those contexts, and if you've worked in areas like this, you know that you can't unsee. Let's put it that way. And so the question about how well are we doing, like what are we doing in science to meet that moment become real? For a little while, I was a direct report to the president of this country, Colombia. So I had been there working, giving advice on poverty reduction and infant mortality, and the president of the country asked to meet me. So I was driven in an armored car to Casa de Nariño. I saw more machine guns in those 30 minutes than I'd ever seen in my life. They were all pointed away from me. And this started to happen. So that's the president of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos. And he started asking me questions about things. Long story short, about 2 weeks later, I became a direct report to him. And so if you're ever a direct report to a president, here's how it works. There's just a little sidebar. There are no phone calls and there's no emails because you're not sure who can see emails and phone calls. Instead, there's a phone call. President Santos would like to see you. And so you fly to Bogota. All right. So that is how this works. So here's the story. And he's amazing. He's amazing. So he started asking me about the Civil War and how to deal with the Civil War that they had there. And there were a number of moments where he asked me the following question. What should I do? Right? I grew up on a farm. I grew up on a farm. I'm like the first person in my family to go to a university. I should have been terrified at that moment, right? Because I knew that the next couple of things the next words I would say could affect the lives of millions of people, and they did. Let's put that out there. But I actually felt very calm at that moment for two reasons. One was because of efforts like BITS, right? One was because I knew there were literatures where people were being precise in terms of measurement and were being transparent about what they found and the generalizability or lack thereof of things they were doing. And it happened that President Santos was asking me questions about things in those literatures, right? So that was the one thing. The other part, the only funny moment we had in the whole time, because it was very serious, but one time it was like 5 o'clock and he was exhausted and I was exhausted. We were sitting in his office and he said, Professor, he said, how do you know all these things? And I said, President Santos, I said, I only know 2 or 3 things. And as long as you keep asking me questions where one of those 2 or 3 things is the answer, we're fine. Otherwise, we're going to have a problem, right? So that was the nature of this relationship. But the point is, there are situations like this all over the world where people bring in, and a number of you have probably done this, where people bring social science in. And at that moment, I want to be a part of social science where people have a commitment to something. And that's to integrity, and that's to fidelity to the evidence and fidelity to causal stories and things of that nature. What we can't do at this moment is check the box, declare victory, and move on, right? That doesn't cut it here. People die when you do this, okay? People don't live the quality of life that they could. But there's a different set of commitments that you can make, right? And there's a lot of them, but one is commitments to transparency, right? Right? Can we be transparent about how we chose what to observe and how we recorded what we observed and how we categorized what we recorded? Because there's a lot of subjectivity in that sometimes, and you want to be able to convey it, right? How we chose to analyze what we categorized, because we often have choices there, right? And the outcomes are not always independent of the part of analysis. How we chose to interpret what we analyzed. And then I got this language from Brian Nosek, so full credit there. And how we could be wrong, right? And just being able to talk about that. in those moments, because that's what people need from us. They don't need a shiny new suit that doesn't fit. Right? I feel like I love social science, but a lot of social scientists, I feel like, oh, this year we think that pink and orange suits will be great. Let's go out and try and convince the world that they need pink and orange suits, right? What people really need are answers to their questions about how do we empower ourselves and others to improve quality of life. So that's a set of commitments we can make. And that's one of the reasons I love this organization. And I love the fact that you've chosen to be here today, right? So I've shown you one example. There are lots of examples. Let's talk about our circumstance now, like the circumstance we're actually in terms of your opportunities. So I want to talk about funding decisions and how they relate to this conversation of public confidence. So I'm not good at doing this. So why should, sorry, oh, is it where I'm pointing it? Ah, okay, thank you. All right. So it turns out to be in an air-conditioned building and to come to a conference like this, someone has to pay for it. Now, some of you may be self-funded. Thank you. Most of you are probably funded by some organization in the job that you have that allows you to do this. And some of you might be privately funded. And again, that's great. But probably most of you are publicly funded in some way. And so there's a question of why should the public pay for your research? And so here's an answer that I'm not convinced by. Well, I'll get to the answer in a second. As we think about why they should pay for your research, at NSF, the average size of a grant in the social and behavioral sciences is about $140,000, includes direct and indirect costs. Median household income in the US as of December is about $74,000. So the average NSF grant in social and behavioral sciences is roughly equivalent to 2 years' earnings, right, of the median household, or the whole year's earnings of 2 entire households in the US. Again, when we think about why the public should pay for your research, you might say, well, my research is inherently valuable, so I don't really need any metrics. I just need to do it and you need to fund it. And that might be okay. People make this argument to me, like no one can count when they want to be held accountable, when they want more FTEs, more budget, more space, more, then people learn how to count. Let's put that aside. You know, someone has to justify this. Like someone, and that turned out to be my job, like in a member of Congress. You know, for this grant, why should we take the entire year's earnings of 2 households and spend it on your study of X, right? It's a legitimate question to ask. And the opportunity costs are real, right? So the opportunity costs. So if you think about just from if you're going to go to money like federal government, here's some of the opportunity costs. So, okay, now I got it. The government doesn't have to fund research. Like they could just cut taxes, they could do that, but they could fund all kinds of other goods and services instead of your research. Now I know where it is. They could give the money to other agencies. It could go to education or roads or defense or nursing or all kinds of things, right? It could go to other topics in research. It could go to other proposals within your areas. And just if you think like, if you're thinking about trade-offs and this is unfair, in fact, the United States Congress could at any time write a piece of legislation saying, you know, we're going to zero out the social and behavioral science budget at NSF and give it to someone else. You need majority of the House, majority of the Senate, president will sign it. That's how easy it would be, right? So these trade-offs are real. Again, I want to live in the world where I can argue for your research in this context, but that's the world we live in. So in that world, why should the public pay for your research? So I want to tell you one answer now that I personally think is unacceptable. And that is, well, so we can create more content. Now, that's not what you say, right? You say, we can create articles and we can have workshops and things of that nature. So 1,000 years ago, content creation in academia was awesome. So like there was a monastery and they studied chemistry. And one day a chemist at the monastery comes out and he says, behold, I have an article in chemistry. And everyone says, huzzah, because yesterday we only had 6 articles in chemistry and now we have 7. This is an amazing human achievement. Okay, so much of what we do at universities runs on some version of that model, but there's basically an infinite amount of content now through a thing called the internet, right? Including lots of content on things that all of us write about. The world doesn't really need content, right? What we need is efficiency and credibility in the service of urgency. That's what people need, right? How can we have credibility and efficiency in the service of urgency? If it manifests as content, then people can see it. But the active, again, if you're young, we can talk about like, but I need to get tenure. Like, we can have that conversation. I think you can do both of these things, but content creation in and of itself is not such a big deal anymore. Okay, anyone can create content. So, how does transparency relate to this? Right, commitments to transparency, right, are a way of demonstrating your fidelity to the underlying empirical and theoretical corpus of what you've done. And people want answers, but people want answers that work, that they can use, right? And when lives are at stake, what they need is for us to be telling them to be committing to this. That's why I love BITS. That's why I love the fact that you're here, because it allows us to do this, right? But it's more than just kind of like, we should do this because it makes us feel good. We should do this because it is related to what the public thinks of us today. So I'm going to show you some evidence of this now. So just as I'm going to show you a study that came out on Monday, right? It published in PNAS. One of the books that I've really been fascinated by the last couple of years is The Knowledge Machine by Michael Strevens. It's kind of this intellectual history of what science is. It's fascinating. But one of the main conclusions from it is he says, examining centuries of scientist behavior, he concludes, I've given up on the objectivity of scientific reasoning, right? And propose in its place a purely procedural agreement. So he looks at people like Newton and some of the great scientists and these wacky things that they wrote when they weren't being a scientist, and works through what is science today, right? And to make a long story short, science is a commitment to a way of thinking and reasoning when you are in the act of doing science. It doesn't control all the wacky and crazy things you might think when you're outside of science. And one of the challenges to science today is we confound those, right? So climate change is something we all study. There is a wonderful literature on climate change. You know what none of it does? When we say save the planet, none of it shows that the planet cares. There's no scientific evidence that the planet cares. There are reasons to care about climate change, some really serious ones, but we actually don't know if the Earth prefers to have human beings on it or not. Like, we just don't have any evidence of that. Right? So there are lots of really good, but the point is, sometimes we'll go in front of people and say, well, science says we must do this to save the planet. It's like, science doesn't say that, right? A pop culture version of it might, but the research doesn't, right? So as we think about the relationship between what we do and what we say and how people receive it, I want to show you a couple things about what the public thinks about us today. So here's a study that came out on Monday. There's a lot of stories now on trust in science. There are a lot of surveys on trust in science, and I don't know if you knew this about surveys. One of the great things about surveys is they're so easy to run. And the worst thing about surveys is they're so easy to run, right? And that a lot of them are, I'm trying to think of what's a nice way to say bullshit? Like, what's a better word? They're just not really meaningful. So I led a group at the National Academies to go over all the research on this in 40 years, including things that was just produced in the last couple of months, and picked out all the surveys that meet certain quality standards. And it's really about the transparency of their methods. So making a long story short. So everything I'm going to show you is from surveys that meet the highest quality standards, and the data is something you could look at today. Okay, so here's some of the sources. If you're in the survey field, you know that these are good surveys. All right, here's some of the top lines, okay? So public confidence in science today is high relative to all of the other groups about whom surveys ask public confidence. Science is up there with the military in the US, and everyone else is generally lower. Okay, I'll show you some graphs in a second. But we're up there, we're still up there with the military. We can talk about why. Like, the data doesn't show why, it just shows that it is. So, sorry. Okay. It is also true that public confidence in science has fallen in recent years. It's fallen over a couple decades, and it's fallen in the last 3 or 4 years. However, trust in every measured institution in this country has also fallen, and the slope of the decline in science is less than or equal to all of the others. So there is a general decline in public confidence in the US of things like science. But the decline in science itself is not unusual, okay? I keep forgetting. So this is hard to look at, but you can just put the thing in the red box, that's science. Does this have a pointer? Does this have a lever? Sweet. Okay. So here's science. So you can see this number. Oh, back to the mic. Hello. Sorry. This number, this is the total of people who have a fair amount or a great deal of trust in science, starts at 76 in June of 2016, goes up to 88, 86 or 87 in 1920. The pandemic happened, it goes down to 73. So there is a decline here. But if you look at this series, the military's up there pretty flat. Everybody else has similar or greater declines or just lower generally, all right? So this is general, this is from Pew, right? There are other time series, the General Social Survey shows roughly the same thing over a longer period of time. Okay, next. So now I want to show you some other things, some more detailed insights of what the public thinks about science. And I'm going to use red, yellow, green just to indicate the meaning of some of the numbers. So here's a question. What percentage of people agree or strongly agree with the statements, scientists in general, and then we're going to name an attribute. Scientists in general are competent. Today, 81% of the American public believes that scientists are either agree or strongly agree with the proposition that they're competent. Green light, pretty good. Are trustworthy. 70% agree that trustworthy. There's a partisan gap, we can talk about that. Okay. Are honest, 68%. You know, in comparison to lots of other groups, pretty good. We can talk about what these numbers mean, but here they are. So that's a good place to start. Are ethical, 65%. All right, let's continue. What percentage of Americans agree or strongly agree with the claim, scientists in general share my values? Less than half of Americans now believe that scientists share their values. There's a second question on the survey about, do they believe that scientists are playing God? A lot of them think that we play God. I didn't include that here because I don't quite know what that question means, but I just put it out there. Feel superior to others. I'm sorry, the contrast is not good here. 36%, that scientists feel superior to others. Is that good or bad? I don't know, but it's out there. Are likable, 42%. Okay, it gets better. All right, so this is so you can see there's some changes here. Now I want to show you something else, and it's about the relationship between what people think we do and what people think we should do. And from my perspective, the most important thing in the paper is what I'm about to show you. Okay, so the same surveys, this is from last year, agree or strongly agree with the statement, scientists provide the public with unbiased conclusions about their area of inquiry. Only about half of the US thinks about this. There are actually more specific questions that were asked about climate science and COVID, and it was around 50%. There's a question here. And the key is provide the public with unbiased conclusions, right? There are other questions you can look in the survey about the nature of bias. There are real concerns about whether we overcome biases, are able to overcome our human and political biases. Only 42% of Americans think we do this. There's a partisan divide. Do whatever it takes to get grants and publish, even if it means cutting corners. Okay. Now, you might not have thought that the American public has opinions about this, but 41% think that we might do this, right? And just to, I want to show you the whole thing here. This is the whole graph. It's not as if, you know, if we think, you know, there's a third of the public, there's a third of the public who's not expressing an opinion. But a lot of people are expressing an opinion about this, and more people believe that we cut corners than believe that we don't, right? So I want to show you one more thing that just puts us in the moment and brings us back to the importance of this endeavor of bits and open science. You might think that in America today, people don't agree on things. right? A, it's not true. It's just that CNN will only focus on the topics where Americans disagree. There are tons of, but I digress. On this topic, on science, it turns out there's a couple of things where 85, 90% of the American public agree. And do you know what it's on? What we should be doing. When you are deciding whether to believe a scientific finding, how important or unimportant is it to you that the scientists who author the study disclose their funders? 84% of the American public think it's important or very important. But here's the kicker. How many think that scientists should be open to changing their minds based on new evidence? 92% of the American public, right? So what is this about? Like, how is this possible? Because one of the stories we like to tell at universities is one of the reasons people don't trust science is they don't understand us. It turns out that while a lot of Americans didn't go to college, all of them went to elementary school, and all of them had had a science in elementary school. And in elementary school science, there are some basic things about what science is that people are taught, and most members of the American public have retained that. The idea that basing conclusions on evidence is big, and the funders is a slightly different story. But when you break down the evidence, you can read the rest of the paper. A lot of the decline in trust is because they think they know what we should be doing. They're just not sure that we're doing it. And the question I would ask you is, are they wrong? Are they wrong, right? You can answer that question for yourself, right? But one of the reasons I love BITS, and I love you for being here, I think they're not entirely wrong, right? I think we sometimes do cut corners, and I think we do let our biases come into papers because there are professional and personal incentives sometimes to walk away from the fidelity to the underlying empirical and theoretical corpus, right? I love us, like I want us to be this, but I think, we can say, well, there's other, non-legitimate reasons that people complain about science. Of course, right? But it can't all be that and produce those numbers, right? So why should the public pay for your research? I think one reason they should pay for it is because you've made a set of commitments that this organization, BITS, brings to the forefront, right? This isn't a secondary consideration for science. These are amongst the first things people should be taught, right? So now to the end, how can we do better? Okay. And now I've learned how to use this. I like to think about every day as a new opportunity to serve, right? I can't, you guys, everybody's had a lived experience. Mine is no better than yours. At the same time, I've just seen things that I can't unsee in terms of what it's possible for us to do and what happens when we're inefficient and what happens when we're not completely honest with ourselves and one another about what we found. And so I feel like every day offers us an opportunity to do a little better, right? So I love science as discovery. I love science as self-fulfillment. But the thing that centers me when things get really rough, when you're in government and things are going a million miles an hour, is the idea of science as service. The idea that we do this with the possibility of empowering others to improve quality of life. That's not a scientific statement. That's like, I guess, a mantra. But it's the thing that kind of helps me, in the situations I've been in that Ted described, it kind of helps me. I felt really calm, and government was amazing and insane. I could tell you stories. Like within the first, I think, 11 days of my term in NSF, I met with members of the Freedom Caucus and the OMB under the President Trump's administration to talk about the value of social science. That was interesting. But I felt very calm at those moments, and they actually went well to talk about why. Because but fundamentally, if you adopt a service orientation to science and you make a set of commitments to that idea, and I think BITS comes right out of that. Because if you're doing science for yourself, BITS doesn't matter. If you're doing science for other people, right, then BITS is everything, right? So that's why I think this is important and more important today than it's ever been. I think it is the key to living up to the public value that people want us to have and to the expectations that our fellow citizens, who incidentally pay for a lot of this, have of us. And moreover, it's something we can do. It's not the easiest thing to do, but it's something that we can do. right? The other thing about this is it's a thing that we're doing, right? So there are so many people that you know who are showing us how to do it. And their examples are really important, right? And so I'm showing you some of these images, you know, some of these folks, some of you don't. They're all awesome. But what I want to tell you about today is I think we're just getting started. There's room for other people to be part of the story. In fact, there's a lot of room, right? And so that's the question that faces us every day. And not every day is great. Some days, you know, there's stuff in your life and you can't like focus on anything, and you have family responsibilities and you can't, but there are some days when you have a choice, like about how to do science, like how to approach it. I feel like the examples that BITS provides, the examples that organizations like this provide are just so critical, not just to what, you know, your opportunities, but what the science can be and how we serve the world, right? So that's the concept. You know, every day we have a choice. I'm so grateful to Ted and to BITS and to all of you for the choices that you make. But every day gives us a new opportunity to do a little bit better tomorrow than we did today. And this gives us a template to do it. So why not? So let's do that. And with that, I yield. So we could do questions, right? All right. Yeah. Multiple choice is fine. I'm a recovering college professor, so the answers might get a little long. Or not. You could ask me about anything really, like all the government goofiness, anything you want. Yes, sir. You could yell into this.
Great. I think now it works.
Okay.
I'm Sean Luna McAdams. I work at SIGA. I manage the Data Science for Development
You're
program.
not on camera. Here, come over here.
I don't want to be. It's fine. They can hear my voice. So I really appreciated your story about Santos and your meeting with him. And I guess I was just curious about how science should manage actors that have other interests in the mix beyond just the technically excellent solution to problems, particularly social problems, and how scientists can both try to have marginal improvements in that sphere without sort of selling their souls, so to speak.
So I'll tell you how I think about it because it's not a scientific answer, right? I think there are four ways to validate a knowledge claim. That is, when I claim to know something, there are four potential bases for it. And so any justification I come up with for a claim is a combination of those things. And so this is the way to the answer. So one is appeals to metaphysics. I can say there are forces beyond the human's ability to perceive that make things right and wrong, true and false. And this is how we know something about the world. And throughout human history, largely through the manifestation of organized religion or things like it, it's a way of knowing. A second way of knowing is through personal experience or testimony. A thing happened to me, I saw this, I felt this, I tell you about it. And it's another way of knowing. Like, you learn something about me. It may not apply to you, but so those are two ways of knowing. A third is everything between the metaphysical and the personal, what we might call culture. Like, we take representations of the past, whether it's about you or me or someone else, we put them in the form of literature or art or history or things of that nature. And we take it and then we try and learn lessons for the present. And so that type of narrative construct is also a way of knowing. So those are three. And then the fourth way I would argue is the scientific method. And what the scientific method does is it's a set of commitments that allow to a type of the production of intersubjective knowledge, right? So a lot of times in science, we can't find what's true, but what I can do is be transparent about a procedure. I can say, I observed this, I categorized it this way, I analyzed it this way, I interpreted it this way, and here it is. And I'm going to give it to you with such clarity that any human being who came up with this process should get the same answer. So I don't know whether it's true or not, but you have a basis for believing it. So when I engage with President Santos, there's two parts of it, right? One is, or any leader, I'm operating in the plane of, here's a set of correspondences, here's the evidence for it. If you do this, this is likely to happen. If you do that, that is likely to happen, right? What I don't pretend to do is know things about metaphysics or culture that I don't, right? And so the ethical choice that I make is do I work with him, right? Do I work with people? And, you know, in that case, civil wars are hard. But in Colombia, that was the longest civil conflict in the Western Hemisphere. 600,000 people had died. Millions were displaced. There were, I can't talk about it. It's just horrible. And, you know, I just had an opportunity to do things where civil wars they don't go from on to off, right? And so there was a way, I had been working on the poverty stuff. And so I saw some ways to do things to kind of, and I showed them how to do some things that could really save lives and sort of lead to better things. And so I thought that was worth doing, right? So that was a long answer, but that's how I manage it. Yeah.
It was a hard question.
Thank you. Lars Villehubert, Cornell. Skip, what do you suggest when faced with the evidence from your surveys? For one, the public seems to think we have biases. For another, they think that we don't change if faced with new evidence. But if I'm really good at what I do, my evidence is pretty robust. I don't need to change it because I'm generating it. So I really need to get it wrong and then change again. Or how do we sort of integrate that dynamic process to demonstrate that based on unequivocally clear evidence that they have to agree on, that I've actually changed my mind on that? How do I prove that to sort of say, yes, I have my biases, but given the evidence, I'll actually change my opinion, which sort of would go to solving both of those problems?
Yeah. So I'm going to answer the question in two ways. So the first answer to your question, the precise answer is, I don't know, right? Because there's a lot of kind of little parts in there. The thing about this data is we asked some detailed questions about what do you think scientists should do? And I was shocked. I'm shocked to see anything in a survey in the US that starts with a 9, right? Like a 2-digit number about how people feel about a potentially controversial thing, and 90% agree to it, right? So even among, so there's a partisan divide in confidence in science that now, it wasn't always true. Actually, until like Kyoto, until the Kyoto Accords, Republicans, Democrats tended to track equally on confidence in science, and Republicans even liked it a little bit more than Democrats traditionally. In Kyoto, it started to break a little bit, and I think the sense among some Republicans was maybe the science is getting political, right? So the thing that we see in the data is about evidence is on the Republican side, there is some sense that if a scientist who they believe many to be liberal were to find something about vaccines or the environment that went against liberal orthodoxy, would they report it? And it's not people aren't doing kind of lit reviews to see this, but I think there's a sense, and part of it is fueled by some social media conversations, that maybe they/we would not, right? So I think that's, in terms of the data, that's the set of correspondences that I can see. That's as much as I know about it. But I don't know that people have a deep theory about when we should change our minds, but I think they want us to generally be committed to, if a fact came up that led to a different conclusion. Now, let me say another thing, right? One of the things that Dr. Fauci got hit with, right, is he changed his mind. He's flip-flopping, right? And so in politics, flip-flopping is not an asset, in part because you're trying to trust a person over a huge portfolio of things to do, and flip-flopping can be seen as inconsistency. And so in political settings, but I've been on a number of committees where we talked a lot about science communication at NIH. And with respect to Dr. Fauci, there is a question about, could he have pitched the whole thing differently at the beginning? Like, we're just figuring this out, the data's coming in, given the evidence we have now, here's what we know, but we're getting new evidence in all the time, right? If that type of lead-in has affected everything he said, when things changed about masks, when we learned more about the vaccine, would he have been in a different place, right? So there's all kind of counterfactuals we can spin, but I think the public sensitivity or vulnerability is, they're convinced that some of us might put ideology in front of the evidence. I think that's the general direction of the evidence.
Great, thank you. My name is Mudhoni, I'm from Kenya. but based in Canada, Wilfrid Laurier University. So I just want to ask a question, or maybe a comment. So you said people want answers and answers that they can use. I personally believe that, but maybe the question is, do these people think that the answers that they're looking for are in the work that I do or we do? And maybe then how I think about that influences my approach in terms of doing research and how, and then my goal. So maybe my goal is, yes, to be transparent, do research and then publish, tenure, etc., but not really to give answers, because maybe I don't even believe that the people are looking for answers in the work that I do.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And just thank you for doing the work that you're doing. I think a lot of people want answers. Not everyone wants science-based answers, right? There are a lot of situations in which the answers people want are ones that make them feel good, or ones that kind of justify a decision that they've already made. And there isn't a lot of room for us there. Like sometimes we can say things, like I've been in situations where I know that's the case, and I try to present a set of facts in a way that no one can, I try to present them so everyone has to hear them, right? So when I leave the room, they can't pretend they didn't hear it. But whether they decide to change or not ultimately is not up to me, right? So there's a lot of people who don't really want scientific answers, but I think there's a lot of people who do. And so the moments that I think about is like when someone asks me for advice, or they ask you for advice about what to do, and I look through a literature. And that's the part where if BITS doesn't exist, I become terrified, because I know about publication bias, and I know about like p-hacking and all the things that people can do. And now, like, if I'm going to a conference and presenting a paper and something's p-hacked, no one's harmed. But if someone has asked me for a question and I say, if you do this, people will live, and it doesn't work, that's terrifying to me, right? So that's when I think of the circumstances where people want answers, like from your work, I want all of us, you might just talk about your work, but sometimes when the problems are so big, you'll talk about your work and other people's work. Like, I want all of us to empower you to be able to look at a literature and tell people, here's a thing that makes the outcome you want more likely, and for that statement to be true, right? So thank you for doing the type of work you're doing.
Kevin Esterling, UCR. Good to see you, Skip. So I was thinking, well, first of all, thinking about the scientists not being likable. I think that has a lot to do with generations of Americans growing up with Scooby-Doo and the evil scientist and but I was thinking about, using, you're using your survey evidence to kind of motivate this, and thinking a bit about the crisis in survey research, which you well know, that I was thinking, even if you're using kind of the best practices, right? Meeting APOR standards to the best of your ability and being as transparent as you can be about your methods, there's still reason not to believe the results, right? And I think that I was thinking that that last point about what Brian said, that we need to be better at saying why we think what we're doing, even if we're doing everything correctly, still could be wrong. And I don't think we do that. And I think in survey research, as long as we do exactly what APOR wants us to do, then we're like, that's the answer. And we're transparent about it, but it's not, because there's still very good reasons to not believe it to be true. And I know you've thought about it more than almost anybody, but I just wanted to mention that. Yeah, thank you.
When we were writing this paper, so the Strategic Council of the National Academies has the president of the National Academies, President Nobel Foundation, my former boss at NSF, and so we're having these conversations about how to write this paper. And to your point, one of the conversations we had is, what is the optimal level of public confidence in science? And none of us think it's 100. None of us want to live in the world where it's 100%, because part of science is asking the question, how could we be wrong? Right? So I don't know what the right number is, but I know it's not 100, right? 100's a scary world to me, right? If people want to have confidence in the scientific method as a way of determining things, I'm fine with that. But I draw a distinction between the scientific method, which I think is for what it does, it can't be corrupted, but scientists can corrupt it. and science as a pop culture phenomena can corrupt it, right? So I'm okay with, so to your point, yeah, but it's very hard. And so you and I spend time in the science and politics world, right? In science, in politics, that can be a really hard story to tell sometimes. So he's like, I don't want uncertainty. I just want to know the answer, right? And so I often have to make decisions. If I have 30 seconds with a member and I know all I'm going to get, what do I tell them, right? And to the question I got before, the rule I had is whatever I say next, I want them to have a more accurate understanding of the world than they did when they met me, right? And I get to control what I say, right? And I don't have to answer the question exactly as it was asked. But if I have 30 seconds with you and I can take an n-dimensional problem and give you a two-dimensional answer that has a positive truth value on those dimensions, empowers you to do something positive, and you don't understand the rest of it, I'll take that bet, right? It's an ethical decision, but that happens a lot.